In our Institute for Gender Studies, we organized each year a course on a topic that could change every year, and in which all kinds of disciplines could participate. So, for instance, we organized a course on blood, a course on migration, a course on love, on what makes the manager. But we also had a course on women and madness, in which a lot of disciplines participated, and I decided to contribute an article on the overrepresentation of women in possession cults all over the globe. And if we talk about the possessed and their worlds, what were the worlds of the possessed that I encountered? The first time I participated in a possession ritual was when I went in 1981-82 with a woman from town. She was working as a personnel manager in a big factory, and she took me to a village of her father to the wedding of her cousin. And actually she was supposed to have married that cousin, so now she was very happy that she did not have any longer, that he did not have any claims on her any longer, and found a wife. And we were sitting in a room with all packed with women and clapping and dancing and singing, and it was very nice. And at a certain moment I felt subtly the music change, and it got another rhythm, and then the atmosphere changed. It was no longer very festive, and all the women withdrew to make space for a woman in the middle of the group. And she became possessed by a spirit, and the musicians adapted to that and played a certain rhythm until she fell down. And then she fell down in the corner where I was sitting, and then later on she told me about her whole history, how she had been very ill the last few years, and that she had gone to a hospital, and in the meantime her husband had died, and terrible problems. And the urban girl who had taken me to the wedding felt kind of embarrassed. Yeah, we were sleeping in the house, so she couldn't have taken me out before these things happened. And she felt embarrassed because to her this wasn't really civilized. You know, this only happened in small villages, but not in town anymore. And half a year later she got married, and during the wedding suddenly I thought, where's the bride? And I searched for her, and she was in a back room, and where I found her, and I said, why aren't you with the guests? And she said, well, they're playing trance music, and if I'm very susceptible to it, so I'm afraid I will lose my senses, and I can't. If I'm a bride, I shouldn't do that. But it turned out that even at her own wedding, late in the evening, when a lot of guests had gone, and when everyone knew this is going to happen, also a trance ritual was performed, and several people fell in trance and became possessed. So I became very interested in the phenomenon, and I started wondering, who are these women? And I found out that by observation and by asking around who were the women who were falling in trance, were actually part of my research group. They were divorced, they were widowed, they were prostitutes, they were somehow women who could not live up to the prescribed role for being a reproductive, decent wife with children. Some were still married, but their husband had an affair outside the home, or their children were dying. So somehow they had problems of being complete women, and to fulfill their gender role. And the same happened with the man. Actually, I didn't see any men falling in trance, although men sometimes are part of the ritual groups or the musicians who perform the trance music. But Vincent Krapanzano wrote a whole book about Touhami, a Moroccan man who was possessed, and he was possessed by Aisha Kandisha. And because he was possessed and she was claiming him, he could not lead a normal married life. And so also for the man, you could say the same applied, that he could not live up to the ideal of manhood that was prevalent in society. So that about the types of women, but I also noted that there were far more women falling in trance than men. And so I started reading the literature, and I noted that a lot of anthropologists mentioned that women more easily fall into trance and participate in trance rituals than men. So then came the question, of course, why is that so? What is the reason behind that? And from the literature, I tried to find out all kinds of different reasons, and so it became a complex of different inputs and different theories about why women would be dominated among the possessed compared to men. And I called this article Dancing for the Saints, because it was connected with saint veneration or saintly spirits, or sometimes people were very vague about who these saints were or who the spirits were. But by seeing that they often did that on occasions where they visited the saints, so the saint's tomb was also a place to fall into trance or to perform trance rituals. And by calling it saints, I could compare it with trance rituals in European history, where people also dance for the saints. And the trance dances get the name of the saints. So you have the Sint Vitus dance in European history. But they also dance for Saint Willebrod and for a lot of Saint Dymphna and other saints. And Saint Dymphna is interesting because it's a town in Geel in Belgium. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but the town is famous because it has a large psychiatric institute, and a characteristic of that institute is that all the patients live with the villagers. And actually that was the time, that was dating from the time of the pilgrimage to St. Dymphna and the trance rituals in the church and outside on the graveyard. And if you look at the church, you see that there's a special room for they call it the ziekenkamer, the room for patients, the medical room or the hospital room. And there were too many people, so they housed them with the villagers, and up till today the patients are still housed there. Let's return to Algeria, because in Algeria, when I asked, I wondered, what could be the reason that women do this, or what are the explanations for that? In a way, you could see it as a psychotherapy, because the people will say, well, she is has mental problems, and it relieves her to do this dance, and she really has to do it after a certain time, otherwise she will get psychologically ill. So it was seen as a psychotherapy, also in the sense of being able to communicate with others what your psychological problem was, because if you cannot live up to the gender norms, it's difficult to talk about it. And in a way you evoke compassion, because in this case also the introduction I started with, the woman told me herself, but if she had not told me, all the other women around it would have told me, so that the whole group knows what's really wrong with this person and they can show compassion. Also, sometimes the spirit speaks through the mouth of the possessed, and this also can be used sometimes to explain what's wrong in a way that sometimes you cannot say things yourself, because that would be accusing other people or saying the wrong things, but the spirit can say anything the spirit wants, and it's not attributed to the woman herself but to the spirit, and in that way it can also work as a psychotherapy. And Lewis said it's also a power negotiation, because by doing so it becomes clear that women are in a less powerful position, and they can claim help. They can, if through the trance dance others can perceive that her husband is maltreating her, they maybe can put pressure on the husband to treat her better, or to behave better. And so it's a form of social stratification in the sense of women compared to men, or a wife versus her husband, often in this case, because or a wife complaining about her children being lost, or the husband is not there but her family not treating her well. And what you also see is that it more often takes place in the lower strata of society, like in this case the village, rather than in town. But that's not totally true, because in town it also takes place, but then in town it takes place among widows. She was the daughter of a widow, the bride I was speaking about. So even although educated, and even although having a good position, she came from the lower strata of society. So possession can be seen as a weapon of the weak in explaining your position. Another explanation would be that it's, or an explanation, it's not an explanation, but actually it's a ritual drama. It's a performance, it's enacted, and in the enactment things are being made clear to the public and to the observers around it. So it exposes social inequalities, and therefore demands social support. And then there's the question, from a totally different field of explanation, the neurological workings of trance. And if you look at trance rituals, they're always accompanied by drums, by flutes, or by anything that can create a certain rhythm. There are people who are now with the windmills, you have to really pay attention, because if the windmill is placed in a certain position versus the sun, and you're susceptible for certain rhythms, then the windmill can make you fall into trance if you're sensitive to it. So it can be evoked by rhythms of light, rhythms of sound, rhythms of movement. You see people bending forward, and according to some scholars, it influences the brain waves. And to say it very simply, because it's far more complicated than them, as that, it sort of attunes the brain waves. So if there is a disruption of the rhythm of the brain waves, being subjected to all these rhythms sort of attunes it with the surroundings and makes you feel better again. So here also a therapeutic aspect, but then in a biological sense. And so the question is still open: are women more sensitive to this ritual stimulation than men are? A far more interesting explanation is that of poisoning by Claviceps purpurea. This is a kind of you can also call it mother corn. It's molded grain infected by ergot. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I once was on a walking trip in Greece, and the guide showed me molded grain by ergot, and I was all excited because it was the first time I'd seen it. But historians have found out that epidemics of possession trance especially take place in certain years of famine and poverty, or the harvest being destroyed by rains and being molded by rains. And then comes the social class difference back again, because the poor eat far more of this bad grain because they know it's not good for them, but you have to eat, so they eat poisoned grain. And the other thing is it's called mother corn, and that's not for nothing, because it's the fungus is used in medicine around childbirth, because it stops the bleeding, and it's also dangerous because I think it stops contractions. But it's used for women especially. So here women come back, social class come back, and it connects it with an explanation which is also valid for the European situation, because there somehow it disappeared. And it disappeared. If you go on pilgrimage to St. Willebrod, you see people still do the dance, the saints dance, and they move forward and backward, and only occasionally maybe 1 or 2 persons a year fall in trance. But the trance bit is totally disappeared, but the cultural remnants are still there. And I had put this in my thesis, and a historian I had put in my thesis a small note on St. Ignatius of Loyola, also expelling the spirits of the possessed. And he said, no, this is impossible. And I said, I'm sure it is. I've seen a picture of it. I've seen a painting somewhere, but I didn't know. I spent half a year looking for the painting, and I found it. And indeed, Ignatius of Loyola was one of these saints who cured the possessed who came on pilgrimage to his place. But okay, so in this way, I try to find all kinds of reasons why, and none of them is valid in every situation, because you have different situations. To start with, the whole idea of possession has to be part of the religious worlds of the people. So you need the terms to do it, you need the rituals to do it, but you also need the conviction that you can fall into trance. And in Europe, we think it's something of others, although all humans have the capacity to fall into trance, but some people are more sensitive to it than others, and if you're extremely sensitive to it, you can try to master it and become a shaman or a ritual leader. As in North Africa, you had ritual leaders who organized these sessions. And there's an interesting documentary about it of Moroccan women, where if it happens, if such a session is made and created by women, then all the doors have to be left open, because someone in the street who hears the sound of the music has to be able to come in and be able to dance. And musicians have the obligation to and to continue with playing until everyone has completed the dance, because if you don't complete it, you really will fall ill. And so there's this ambiguity. On the one hand, it's seen as an illness, and on the other hand, it's seen as a religious ritual that you actively look for and go to or organize. And this is not, in a sense, a contradiction, because you get addicted to, once you've done it, you get a little bit addicted to it. So it becomes part of becomes part of your being. And so these are the reasons I could find in the literature about why women more than men fall into trance, and that you could apply to all the different cultures and wonder which reason is in place in this culture that I'm studying. And I'm sure the Inuit, of course, they don't depend on grain, because another statistic is that in grain cultures it happens more often, and you have more of these epidemic because you have this molded grain. So outside the grain cultures, it's probably less and maybe caused by other reasons than it has other causes than ergo poisoning. Okay.